I just want to make the case that there are levels of intensity of mental health intervention that are totally appropriate for schools and that in the current environment are necessary, if not indispensable, because there's legislation that is holding them in place. Or it may be because there are certain subgroups of students who that's like the only mental health support they're receiving.
You must be some kind of therapist.
My guest today is Jonathan Cogburn again, welcoming back to the show. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist in Texas, who you might recognize from a recent episode, number 180, after Charlie Kirk, which was about moral courage. And I'm welcoming back Jonathan for part 2, because last time we spoke, which was not too long ago, he had mentioned that he has thoughts and professional experience in the realm of school mental health services and thoughts on preventing school shootings. And I think it would be interesting to get a conservative perspective on this issue, as Jonathan is a conservative, given the amount of debate we've had on this podcast about the downsides of mental health services in schools and some of the ways that school counselors have let down and alarmed parents through some of their behavior. So really glad to have Jonathan's expertise on that topic today. Jonathan, welcome back. Good to see you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm really glad to get to come and chat about this topic. This is the area that I work in full time. And essentially, I just want to make the case that there are levels of intensity of mental health intervention that are totally appropriate for schools and that in the current environment are pretty necessary, if not indispensable. And that they may be indispensable because there's legislation that is kind of holding them in place that schools are required to maintain compliance about. They have to demonstrate records as such that they are, having programs implemented with some kind of fidelity. Or it may be because there are certain like subgroups of students who that's like the only mental health support they're receiving because of their life situation. We'll talk. I'm going to tell you all about your audience about McKinney-Vento law and McKinney-Vento students today. Curiosity. Have you ever heard that term before? McKinney-Vento?
McKinney-Vento? No.
Mhm. See, this is almost all therapists out there that I run into. So we'll get to that in just a little bit. I'm sure that's an important, very important topic. I think it's something that therapists should have more awareness of.
Okay,
Um,
what is McKinney-Vento?
So McKinney-Vento refers to the McKinney-Vento Act, which was passed in 1987, and it has been kind of renewed or forwarded in subsequent legislation since then. The No Child Left Behind Act picked it up. The Every Student Succeeds Act picked it up. So these more recent, like large chunks of legislation, federal legislation that govern education picked it up. Now, so McKinney-Vento Act, we use the term McKinney-Vento students to refer to those students that meet the educational definition of homelessness. And this may sound kind of strange, like why do we need an educational definition? And the long story short of that is the various living situations that students find themselves living in. They may have like a roof over their head, but it may not be adequate support or an adequate living situation, adequate stability for them to be able to perform in their academic development really well. And so the definition of homelessness is actually wider for McKinney-Vento students than it is for the HUD definitions of homelessness. So, for example, if let's say I were to lose my job and couldn't pay my rent anymore, and I move in with my brother, on his lease or in his home, but I do not have any legal recourse if, say, we have a contentious relationship and he decides he wants to kick me out and my kids with me, and then we're just loose out on the street there. So in the educational definition of homelessness, the term to describe that situation is doubled up. I would be doubled up with my brother. We'd have two families under a single roof, and I don't have any legal tie or any protection allowing me to remain there. So there's it's kind of a borderline instability idea there. And add to that, you get two families living under a single roof. then the physical space may not be adequate for me to be able to do things like work on projects and homework in the home. And I mean, we've seen plenty of families who, had two households living in a RV, like a 20 or 30-foot RV stacked up. And I mean, that's a really hard situation to go home to and then do homework and then be able to have clean clothes, just being able to have all of the same resources as your peers who, live in a single family dwelling with their parents. There is a term in McKinney-Vento law that a lot of people have heard out there, which is unaccompanied youth. We've heard that term in the news a lot in reference to migrant children, immigrant children. I'm using the term migrant because that's the federal education code term, not for any political reason there. But we see unaccompanied youth are those. My best friend, one of my best friends in high school, was an unaccompanied youth and would have qualified for identification as a homeless student under McKinney-Vento law. I had no idea what that term was back then, but he got kicked out of his house when he was 18. And so in that situation, the idea is, you typically need like a parent to help you with things like FAFSA application. And you may need your parents to kind of co-sign on some things to get you going in your college education. And so there are some additional barriers to you being able to proceed your educational, post-secondary educational career if you don't have a parent there by your side. And so there are some legal exemptions. So for example, if Luke had been identified and had gotten the help of the school district McKinney-Vento liaison. By the way, every school district in the nation is required to have a McKinney-Vento liaison whose responsibility it is to assign that identification within the student's permanent record in whatever system the school uses to do their record keeping. And in that way, then the student can receive some of these exemptions, like an exemption letter to the Texas Department of Public Safety when you're 16, to be able to go and get a driver's license without a primary legal guardian signing for you to be able to get that. So to me, this is an important topic to mention because it's a whole arena of support that most mental health professionals haven't even heard of. But if I could give kind of one request to your listening audience, it would be, if you work a lot around a school district, it'd be to find out who the McKinney-Vento liaison is. And, if you have a sense that like, okay, this student's living situation changes and they're doubled up now, or, this student's now couch surfing in someone else's house. If the mental health professional, sometimes the mental health professional can be very important in getting that identification made because the school may not have picked up yet on the student's living situation changing. And we would just want them to be able to access any of those supports through the district that would be possible. And this won't be any surprise to you or anybody listening that when somebody finds themselves in that living situation, they're very often guarded about it because there's, guilt or potential shame kind of tied up in that. And so that the school district liaison can use all the help she can get usually to be able to track down and find who these kids are. And I'll add one more note, and you may have some questions or thoughts or something. I don't want to hog the mic the whole time on that, but the school district liaisons where I work, we have one who's full-time in the liaison job, and that's the one. He works for Abilene ISD out here in West Texas, and so it's our largest district. It's a 5A district. The rest of our districts out in this area are very small and rural, and so those liaisons are usually like the school counselor, and they're the state testing coordinator, and they might be the GT testing coordinator, and they may be the director of other federal programs. So this is like the 5th or 6th job title they have. And it's very hard for them to keep track of, juggling all those plates that they tend to have in those small school settings. So think of ourselves as mental health professionals as potential members of a team to help get these kids appropriately like labeled in the records and access to some more help and support.
So that's one good reason for there to be some level of mental health services in schools, just to have an eye out for those kids who are truly at risk. These kids are in unstable living situations. You gave a good example there by distinguishing sort of the common understanding of homelessness as literally not having a roof over your head from the definition in the school system, which I think does sound more appropriate for the sake of protecting and providing for students in unstable situations. And I think you're right to point out that those students would typically feel shame about their living situation or perhaps try to hide it for the sake of their family as well. And just to give an example, because I grew up with my mom teaching in a very poor part of downtown LA where most of her students were first and second generation Mexican immigrants with, typically 2 or 3 families to an apartment building.
Yes.
So I know just what you're talking about there, and so that's I think a good place to start. And in that context, you're framing these school counselors as not so much providing mental health services to students, but as more in a social work role, more a liaison, a bridge.
Exactly. And those liaisons they're often helping the students access other community services. And something else I didn't mention before that's kind of an important piece of this. So every school gets a certain amount of designated McKinney-Vento funding that can be used. Let's say the student needs school supplies. Well, if that student's identified, then some of that funding can be tapped into to buy school supplies that are required for those individual students. They had to leave their previous living situation in a hurry and they don't have any clothing. Well, so some of those funds could be used to help purchase emergency clothing or emergency food. When American Rescue Plan was in full effect, we I don't want to go back to having that amount of money, by the way, because it was honestly more money than we could figure out how to spend. We had lots and lots of money um, on in the McKinney-Vento program that I'm a part of. And so just for your listeners' benefit, so I work for an agency that serves about 40 school districts. And so my job is to train the McKinney-Vento liaisons in how to properly identify what are the characteristics or conditions that result in identifying a student who's homeless, and then what are these supports that are available to them in the way that we're talking about. And then just helping their program to function, like providing them with template documents and things like that to take some of the extra burden of just figuring out the job off of them when, that's their fifth or sixth extra job title. And I love that. My job is wonderful because it's my kind of central mission in my head is just to always make things more streamlined or easier for or attainable for the school folks that are pretty overworked in most cases, and especially in these little bitty towns. So, but from that agency setting, we got a huge chunk of funding, and so we were doing things like buying bunches and bunches of books. I think we bought 6,000 books each summer over the 2 summers that we had that funding, and we handed those books out with a backpack in a backpack to how many? I think over about 1,500 students got books for the summer so that they had books at home they could read. Oh, here's a fun one. This is one we've actually been able to continue. This last week, we had our student leadership summit for our entire region for those students. And so what we do is we give the district liaisons a template invitation that just says, "Hey, you've been nominated to attend this leadership summit. We think you would be a good candidate to come and learn and hear from a guest speaker and just spend a day getting kind of pumped up." And so we had 80 students from across the region come last week, and we brought in. Do you know the movie Freedom Riders?
No.
Okay, so this is a movie that came out early 2000s, and Hilary Swank plays Erin Gorell, who was the teacher, the real life teacher that the film is kind of about as the central character. We've had Erin come and talk at our agency twice so far, but we had a couple of her original students come and serve as the keynote speakers for this last week. And those are, you know, grown men now who have kind of like made their way in life, but credit where they are to the support they got in her classroom. So just like kind of success stories of overcoming. It was really, really cool. Nike donated a pair of Nike Dunks for every student that came, which is freaking amazing. So they left for a campus tour. We took them to a technical college that's like they have 18-month programs in a lot of different areas like electrician, EMT, some wind farm stuff, aviation maintenance programs. So they went and toured all that stuff. And while they were gone, we made little pyramid stacks of Nike Dunks across the front of the room. And they got to come in and we just called their names and they got to come up and grab their shoes. Chick-fil-A donated box lunches for us. So just amazing. I just love stories of kindness and generosity like that. And I will tell you, I was skeptical about what the impact of an event like that would be. As a therapist, I'm like, okay, like a one-off event like this, eh. But I was wrong. I'm happy to say I was underestimating the potential impact because we've had students go on to make connections with those speakers and go on to some post-secondary opportunities that they might not have otherwise. We've been able to get scholarship help for a lot of them, and they've gone through some scholarship coaching. One of the coolest things that I've heard, and I've heard more than once from the district liaisons is, these two kids never really hung out before, but they rode in this Suburban, to the event and after, and they have remained like best friends ever since then. So it's like widening the social circles of some of these kids. And those are effects I wouldn't have predicted. And add to that, a lot of these kids are, they're in little bitty towns, like 200 people, 500 people, 1,000, 1,500 people in the town total. And they barely leave, their little bitty towns. They're, an hour and a half away from the nearest city, which is, not a big city by a lot of standards. It's about 130,000 people right in the Abilene area. And Abilene may be the only big city they've ever been to. So it's like a first in a lifetime experience for some of them. It's really cool. It's a big undertaking every year, but it ends up being worth it every single time. So I really love that. Oh gosh. And then so I might segue us and just jump into talking a little bit about AMHP because that's the Association of Mental Health Professionals Conference. I was like a holdout for till the last minute about whether I was going to go or not because our summit was on last Wednesday, and I was like, oh gosh. And I had to drive into AMHP then after our homeless student summit. So it was a pretty wild day, quite a long day of getting up and being there at the college before 7 and then spending all the day. And then it's about a 3-hour drive over to Carrollton, Texas for me, which is not terrible, but would have preferred it on a calmer day. So, but I just wanted to give a quick shout out. And I think you said you're going to be interviewing Kathleen pretty soon, who's kind of the central figure in the Association of Mental Health Professionals. She's kind of the mastermind behind it. But her partner, Philip, is a great host, a great MC as well. And so we had 2 days worth of sessions, and a lot of them were on kind of like the overlap between natural medicine and therapy, potentially. A lot of research on how particular treatments can affect neurotransmitters or blood levels of minerals and how that influences mental health. And this is not something I've studied a whole lot, but it's very interesting. And we also had a dinner with Prisha Mosley as one of the panel speakers, and that was just really, really powerful to hear her talk about some of what she went through and how she sees it now. And I messaged her on X after I got home, and I just told her, "Hey, you said something that stuck with me that I'm going to think about for a long time." And I'm not going to get her exact quote right, but she said something to the effect of, I don't like the term detransition. It's kind of a misnomer. There can't be detransition when there was no transition to begin with. And so I think she was kind of arguing for a reframing of language that I think is a scientifically accurate reframing. And but that's, detransitioner is the term we have right now. But I was just like, man, that is such a powerful thought. And, a testimony to the fact that we just get into using terms and then we don't question them after a while. They just become our normal terms, but we don't think about the underlying meaning behind those things. So, anyway, so I would put in a shout out for AMHP, the AMHP conference. They are tentatively scheduled for October 1st and 2nd next year. And I believe Kathleen said she'll tell you when she comes on, but I believe she said that the tickets will come up for sale in February for that. So that's what I'm remembering off the top of my head. But especially if you're conservative, if you're more in the moderate territory, I have no doubt that you would be welcome. But just full disclosure, you're going to have a lot of bold conservative people like Soad Tabrizi running up to you and giving you lots of hugs while you're there. But it was so nice to just. I was sitting there at the end of the conference and I was thinking about the last mental health events I've been to and how just been a feeling of kind of a wet blanket on me of like, I can't really say what I actually believe out loud here, say at some of those legacy organization events. And, it's just, I won't say that was like torturous or anything, but it is kind of sad. But it was so nice at AMHP because I could say whatever I thought or believed and not have to worry about, anybody taking it the wrong way. No eggshells were on the floor.
Well, I had a similar experience recently at GenSpect. I'm very glad I went to the GenSpect conference. I wasn't able to make it, as you know, to AMHP this year. I do have it on my radar for next year, and listeners can look forward to my interview coming soon with Kathleen Mills from the Association for Mental Health Professionals. I might also be running some ads on my show for them just to promote awareness that this is an organization you can join. But it was such an experience being at GenSpect and, maybe 200 people that I'd known online or who knew me, and meeting everyone in 2 back-to-back 16-hour days. It was wild. And I still haven't, it took me a while to settle afterward, and I still need to go through my notes from the conference and reach out to all the people I met or heard speak who I intended to have on the show. I mean, there's probably like 20 people who've been on the show already who were at the conference. But to go back to the topic of school services, I mean, you've made a strong case for something that I think is hard to disagree with and very much in harmony with American values, with Western and Christian values. It's this idea that we're looking out for the most vulnerable members in our society, students, their children, and trying to give them a better future, trying to not let the unfortunate circumstances of whatever ill fate has befallen their family to interfere with their ability to learn valuable skills and have the resources that they need in order to make good choices. And like I said, it's more kind of a social worky role that I'm hearing here. And I'm listening, though, more broadly to the subject of school mental health services, thinking, okay, so I think a lot of people could agree that it's good that we have these liaisons in schools who are looking out for students with unstable housing and making sure that they're connected to resources. And of course, all who work with children, like teachers, for instance, are also mandated reporters, just like therapists and doctors are mandated reporters. So if we know that actual abuse or neglect is occurring, there's a duty to involve professional services. Now, we can debate how those services are delivered. Like, for instance, in Oregon, I have I have called CPS about homeless families, and they say, well, it's not a crime to be homeless. And so I'm seeing these, young children out panhandling with their mom on a dangerous corner and CPS doesn't investigate. But if you were to call a middle class if you were to call about a middle class family that provides their kids with housing and food and security and say the mom is refusing to affirm this child's gender identity, well, CPS might get involved in that case. So there's the concept of mandated reporting as an ideal element of safeguarding, and then there's the reality of how these institutions have been captured. But I do want to pivot to the provision of mental health services, because I think that's something that I've questioned a lot on this podcast. I've had several guests who are very critical of it. And I say this as someone whose first internship as a therapist was in a school setting. I've also explained that maybe I have a bias against that because my internship was not run well. I've mentioned, I can't remember on which episode or to which guest, but I mentioned that the person in charge of that program at the time didn't really have a lot of patience for working with brand new therapist students like myself, and tried to get me to I don't know if what she wanted me to do was illegal or just unethical, but it certainly would have gotten me in trouble if I'd done it, which was to have a non-licensed professional sign off on my hours. Or no, for the a non-licensed professional with training that didn't meet our state's criteria to be the one to provide my supervision and then have the social worker in charge of the program sign off on the hours that the other person had supervised. So they tried to get me to cheat essentially so that they could work with their limited budget and resources and volunteers. And when I was like, I don't think that's how this is supposed to work, they were upset with me. So and that was my experience back when I was a baby therapist. And, I can look back on my first few jobs and how under resourced and undertrained we all were. And I can make that argument that if you are going to have services in schools, they should certainly be better run than the services that I personally experienced. But more broadly, I think there are concerns about the appropriateness of school, which is a place that many kids go to get away from their problems at home, being a place where they can't compartmentalize because they're asked to be vulnerable in a space where they don't actually have the level of confidentiality that is the level of confidentiality and autonomy and choice that are required for good therapy to take place. And then there's the concern about, the same therapist seeing their friends and issues with privacy there. And all of that is not even to begin to get into the subject of these school counselors grooming, indoctrinating, and transitioning minors without their parents' knowledge or consent. So those are the kind of issues with school counseling that we've talked about on this podcast before. And, now that we've sort of checked the box of covering services that are hard to disagree with, like the McKinney-Vento, I'd like to kind of graduate to your thoughts on those more kind of controversial areas.
Definitely. And so, just to give a little bit more context, uh, and I want to say this because I think it's important to hear about places where things are going well and that things are not just totally nutty bars everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, in my really, really rural setting in West Texas, there's not a whole lot of leftist ideology floating around. So right after you and I, right around the time you and I talked last, there's a district in my area that let two teachers go over comments that were made about Charlie Kirk online, but that's, two teachers out of about 40 school districts. So there are a small handful of people who are kind of very interested in more in leftist politics, leftist ideology, but it's by and large very absent here. And the the largest problem that is faced when trying to deliver mental health support to schools around here is that you generally have people who are overworked, or you have districts that are way understaffed trying to implement something like a what I would consider to be a good SEL program, not one that's chock full of leftist ideology, but one that helps the students to develop emotional differentiation, conflict resolution skills,
Sorry, when you say SEL, for people who haven't heard that before, go ahead.
social emotional learning is what that refers to. Yes, thank you for calling me out on defining the acronyms. Phew, education is the worst about having therapists is therapy is probably second place for having the most ridiculous number of acronyms. But yeah, so social emotional learning, which among people in our corners of the internet is becoming or has become kind of a dirty word. It's a controversial word because people automatically associate it with this idea of indoctrination. And I can tell you, I have helped to implement SEL programs that are not chock full of leftist political ideas, social theories, and I have watched that do amazing, amazing things. I've walked into a school where you go inside and there is an adult right there with like a pair of students, but the student is the one who takes the responsibility for greeting you as the visitor of the school and, looks you in the eye and shakes your hand and says, "Hey, welcome. I'm so and so. Who are you?" And, introductions are made and then they go around the school and they give you a tour of every bulletin board that has to do with their personal goals or their classroom goals or their school goals and what they're working on. And they can explain where they are in the process of growth as an individual student, as a classroom, as a school, in academic performance. So there are some really amazing positive programs out there that help students to work on personal organization, conflict resolution, growing emotional differentiation, such that they have greater control over their own emotional states, in a psychoeducation fashion and in a like classroom lesson delivery fashion, not so much like an individual therapy like we mental health professionals would think of it.
Many of you listening to this show are concerned about an adolescent or young adult you care about who's caught up in the gender insanity and therefore at risk of medical self-destruction. I developed ROGD Repair as a resource for parents just like you. It's a self-paced online course and community that will teach you the psychology concept and communication tools the families I've consulted with have found most helpful in understanding and getting through to their children, even when they're adults. Visit rogdrepair.com to learn more about the program and use promo code SOMETherapist2025 at checkout to take 50% off your first month. That's rogdrepair.com. Let me ask you about this because one of my sort of gut negative reactions at this point in time to the things that I hear about this type of service in schools is that I really want therapy to be voluntary. I think
Yes.
good therapy can only take place in a voluntary environment. And whenever it's not voluntary, there are ethical issues and compromises. And we could have a whole conversation just about that, but I won't zoom in on that. I'm just going to say that there are there are harms and ripple effects when people have an early experience of feeling that any type of mental health service is being imposed on them or that, for example, I'm going to be graded on this. I'm going to be asked to share something personal and then I'm going to be judged or, so that blurring of lines between school where some of your work is public, where you are being judged on your conduct and your right and wrong answers. And sometimes you're being judged in front of your peers, you know, the blurring of the lines between that experience where students know what to expect if they've been in school a few years and the much different set of rules that applies to anything regarding the content of your own private thoughts and emotions, anything vulnerable. I just have a lot of concerns with that. And so when I hear about, as good as you make it sound, especially if there's no indoctrination into a radical belief system, if it's just basic, emotional literacy and social skills and things like that, as good as that sounds, I'm thinking, do students know how to distinguish, am I being graded on this? The kind of the secondary dimensions, like, or is this optional, right? If I'm being asked to share how I feel about something, can I say no? Because
Right.
I think it sends the wrong message, especially when I don't know. I'm struggling to articulate my thought here, but it's I think potentially turns people off of therapy later in life to have those experiences, and it also confuses children as to, what is therapy, what is expected of me, and where am I being judged, and where am I truly just free to express my thoughts and get help, and is that private, and is it mandatory, and like all that kind of stuff. That's what I worry about.
Mhm. Yeah, you're pushing in a really good direction, in a really healthy direction with that question, I think, which is what is the if we're going to have mental health support in school, what is the like max ceiling limit for what that should be? So a little while ago, right around the time we talked last, I was writing a Substack article that I've since finished, and I'll mention a couple of things from that to maybe kind of help answer your question. Although you have just full disclosure, you have made me think of things with that question that I have not considered so far. So you're giving me homework. Like I'm going to have to write a follow up to my original article now, which is fine. And that's something that I said in the article is that I've made some suggestions for ways things could be structured that aren't perfect, and I want them to be better. I want to kind of strengthen the plans and the arguments that can be made for good, and I also want to close any gaps for problems like the ones that you're bringing up. So the first thing that comes to me, so in I would say in the SEL programs that I have personally witnessed and or helped to implement, there has not been very much, if any, close discussion of like personal mental health topics. So an example of an activity would be so we're gonna write a class vision statement type activity. And so then what are elements of classroom culture or behavior or skills that we want to be present when we interact with each other in this classroom? And the teacher gets the students involved in generating some of the terms, some of the classroom norms, basically. So we want to be a classroom where people treat each other kindly, where we're patient with one another. And so it's really about for a vast majority, and again, I can this is what I've seen. It doesn't refer to all programs out there by any means. But they're focused on involving the students in co-creating some positive classroom culture. That's really the primary intent. And the one that I helped implement did not have any discussion of mental health topics specifically in general. We never talked about depression. We never talked about anxiety. We never talked about trauma.
Good.
We talked about things like, okay, when you get really upset, can you pause? Can you insert a pause in the interaction there? And then think about what skills you might bring to bear to help the interaction turn out productively.
I could get
Or
behind that.
yeah, or we might be having, a lesson on how do you prioritize important tasks. And so we are kind of touching on mental health, we're touching on cognitive emotional functioning with the lesson, but we're not getting to the individual student level.
Yeah.
Um, and that's not to say that never happens. You may have like a school counselor take a small group lesson for say students who are struggling with behavior to a little bit more specific detail. However, in Texas now, if you're going to do that, there has to be specific affirmative parental consent signed for your student to participate in that. And you're also legally required, the school district is legally required to make the materials available to parents.
Good.
And that's a result of Senate Bill 12 that passed back in April or May. So there are some in Texas there are some protections built in for some of those types of concerns.
Well, I know that I gave you a lot more than that to respond to, but can I bring in a new element as well?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Because you said that it doesn't get to the level of scrutinizing an individual's psyche or talking about psychiatric diagnoses or things like this. And I started thinking about how irresponsibly many aspects of society are handling the topic of suicide right now. One example is there is an elementary school that I have passed with a sign. You know those signs, I forget what they're called, but where you can change the letters on the sign? Like
Oh
most
yeah,
schools
like
have
a
them.
a marquee.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. So the marquee of this elementary school said something about Suicide Prevention Week.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking, you're teaching the word suicide to elementary school kids? And then you're teaching them that they have something to do to prevent it? That's wrong on so many levels. I mean, first of all, it is not your job as a teacher or school administrator to teach young children about disturbing things like suicide. That needs to be left to the parents to teach children if and when it comes up. You should not be bringing it up because now some little kid's gonna be like, "Mommy, what's suicide?" Right? And it's not because of something that you willingly exposed them to because you thought they were ready to learn about this topic. It's because their school put it on the marquee. And then to talk about suicide prevention in an elementary school, I think I don't know how they're talking about it, but to me that sends a confusing message as if students, I mean, this is elementary school, we're talking 10 and under, as if they have something to do with preventing. I mean, now granted there is a case to be made that bullying prevention is suicide prevention because bullying is a factor that can lead towards suicide. However, I still think even the worst bully in an elementary school, that your motivation for teaching that kid not to be a bully should not be the guilt trip of you might cause someone to kill themselves. Like, that's too big of a guilt trip to put on a little kid.
No, yes, agree.
So it's like, and where I see this mirrored, because here I am talking about really inappropriate word to use with small children. And I see this mirrored in the ways that teens are pulled into codependent, enmeshed, toxic relationships with each other due to online influence, under supervision in the online world. Teens are teaching each other to self harm, or they're feeling responsible for, again, suicide prevention in their friends. And I hear so many stories, given that my work is coaching parents of troubled youth. I hear so many stories of times that some 17-year-old who was developmentally, emotionally quite younger than 17. You know, maybe academically he was 20, but emotionally he was 12, and he's losing sleep at night because he feels like it's his job to prevent his friends from committing suicide. And I look at the situation like, okay, who are we worried about, and have their parents been notified? Like,
Yes.
is that child receiving appropriate support? Because it is not your child's job. Your child is not a trained crisis counselor. They're not that kid's parent. Your kid still has a lot of growing up to do. Your kid should not be losing sleep thinking that it's their job to stop their friend from offing themselves.
Yep.
So, and you know, now we've mentioned this topic, and so this episode's going to be censored because the algorithm doesn't want us
Because
talking
we
about this.
said
They want us
this
using
word.
ridiculous newspeak like unalived. And I just
No.
refuse to talk that way, even if it lowers my exposure to new audiences. But it's that sort of stuff in the culture that, you know, where we're teaching children who should not be burdened with other people's mental health crises that it's their job to save everyone. Like, that worries me so much. And I worry that some of these well intentioned services in schools are unintentionally sending kids the message that you are responsible for other people's mental health, not just, you know, be kind and solve problems productively and create a positive classroom environment, but you're responsible for your friend's depression and anxiety and suicide risk.
This is not an emotionally differentiated lesson that we're talking about here. This is this Murray Bowen would not be happy with this kind of lesson being taught at all. Murray Bowen was the founder of multi-generational family therapy, by the way, and as far as I know, coined the term emotional differentiation for y'all out there listening. Yeah, no, you're on a bullseye on the topic of where things get really sticky or where lines go too far. As you were talking about the idea of helping to helping to talk to, you were going to talk to elementary kids in a way that's going to help them to contribute to suicide prevention. That I was like, well, what would I, if I was going to do that developmentally appropriately, what would I even teach them? What would the topic be? And the only thing that comes to mind right off is hey, you're not responsible for the behavior of those around you. You are responsible for your own behavior, and you may have really strong emotions sometimes. And so what happens when you have really strong emotions? How do you deal with that? How do you help that to become better or less intense? And if you did some teaching with them about like healthy coping of, connecting to a trustworthy friend or reaching out to an adult that is a reliable caregiver, and just avoiding isolation. Like that would be a good upstream lesson that you could teach elementary kids that would lay some foundational groundwork for them of skills that could help them avoid falling into suicidality later. But I would not ever want to mention the term suicide or the concept of suicide in an elementary school. Personally, I don't think that'd be a good idea. One of the things that I talk about in the Substack article that I wrote is the idea of over medicalized programs being a problem. And I don't remember if you and I talked last time about like the history of marriage and family therapy, where our field came from, but it came as a counter reaction to over medicalization of medical diagnoses, and medical doctors becoming more and more involved, and creation of diagnostic categories. And then what these early family therapists, who were psychiatrists at the time, were noticing is that it was getting harder to treat people because they were internalizing the label of their diagnosis at the level of identity.
No way.
Yes,
This is
so this is mind blowing, right? This is
this
not the
is
first.
are we talking about the 1960s?
Yes, uh-huh. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Please
We're
go
talking
on.
we're talking about the 1950s and the 1960s.
Okay.
And Ludwig von Bertalanffy, Gregory Bateson, a lot of the therapists who work at the Palo Alto Institute, this is the case that they were making, is that, okay, these diagnostic labels, like, we see the intent of it trying to help, but it's kind of having a paradoxical effect. And we don't want this paradoxical effect. And so they started working. They had already Bateson and Bertalanffy had started working with general systems theory as a theoretical model for understanding human behavior. And they used that to describe what was happening, both with the over medicalization situation and with they were trying to treat people with schizophrenia, and just noticing the effect that family interaction had on visit weekends in this inpatient facility where they were working with these patients. And they noticed when the families would show up, the patients would regress. They'd go back into previous maladaptive, bad coping or negative reactions or more intense symptoms. And at first they were like kind of blaming the family, but when they started to apply general systems theory kind of more fully, what they realized is it's just a relational context. This is the environment, the family environment in which their symptoms developed originally. So then when you re-expose them to that environment, that they go back into the homeostasis they were in, the balance of symptoms or lack of symptoms that they were in when they were living with the family, because family relationships are extremely powerful in shaping our behavior. And we all kind of have not we have roles, whether we like it or not, and they're somewhat fixed. We can like swap roles, but that actually takes quite a lot of effort usually to do. I mean, all this. So this is just some general systems theory stuff getting applied in general, but that as they were writing about these theories, they were putting them out there as an alternative to this over medicalization model. And the over medicalization of everything is what was their primary motivation for proposing an alternate theory that didn't result in labeling that sunk into identity, that made homeostasis even more like concrete. in trying to change it.
I know some of this, but I've never heard it articulated this way before, and it's it's creating light bulb moments for me because I'm thinking about when I was learning about family therapy as a baby therapist, in my mid-20s and lacking the context that I have now and hearing what you're talking about is, well, that's the problem we have now, right? We have this highly individualistic, egocentric relationship with disorders, secondary gain. These are the clinical terms for it, but I break these things down in my course for parents. I explain how these psychological concepts about what people are getting out of remaining ill and clinging to this label affect the issue that so many families are faced with today, which is kids identifying as something other than what they are and then wanting to medically alter their entire futures because of that identity. So I explain these concepts for people now, but to think about it in the sense that our field in particular, the field of marriage and family therapy, as opposed to the field of, licensed professional counseling, licensed clinical social work, all these similar license paths out there, our field really originated in this not only systemic view of what was going on in the context in which symptoms emerge and the function that they served in the family system, but in rebellion against the over medicalization and the individualism and secondary gain that goes along with that. And it makes me want to defend our field more. What I've often looked at when I think about the history of our field is just that the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy was formed in the 60s, and I look at how many more Americans were married and in families in the 60s. Like, our profession is supposed to be about marriage and family,
Yes.
which used to be a bigger part of American life. Now we're so atomized, and my my complaint, I've said this at least 5 times on this podcast, but if you go to the AAMFT website today, American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy website, what's one of the main menu options? Transgender resources. Are there
Yeah.
resources for marriages and families? No, they put
No.
transgender resources, right? Which we know is incredibly the ideology that destroys families. But I love the angle that you're taking there, and I'm sure there was maybe another point that you were trying to make with that.
Well, I can kind of pause. First of all, amen to what you said about defending the profession. I'm gonna shout out one of my great teachers, Tom Milholland. He's not on the internet much. He is just about 80 years old. He taught my general systems theory class. One of the most brilliant men that I've ever met, I think. I started getting to have coffee with him again recently. He was a AAMFT president back in the day, like back in the 80s and 90s. He has license number 1 for LMFTs in Texas because he helped spearhead the creation of the license in the 80s. So he's old school. And so anything I just told you, I credit to sitting in that first semester class with him, and for whatever reason that stuff stuck. There is an incredibly proud intellectual tradition that has really had no business altering the global therapy landscape as much as it did, considering how small it still is. Marriage and family therapy birthed dozens of therapy models, and we helped to mainstream others like emotionally focused therapy that wasn't widely accepted in psychology until we found Sue Johnson, and she like, you're one of us. You're going to come to our conferences, and Sue would have made it without us. I'm not going to. She was a brilliant lady and a great teacher. I'm thankful to have gotten to hear too. But I mean, narrative therapy, solution focused brief therapy, internal family systems, structural, strategic. All these models came from a field in less than half a century, and in an environment where none of this social justice theory was even thought of for most of that history. Um, and so my whole platform on social media really is, I want the proud intellectual tradition to be defended and not to continue to be eroded by ideas that are philosophically opposed. I don't know. That's the best phrase I've come up with so far, that these social justice ideas are philosophically opposed to what I learned in general systems theory. Okay. So let me take the beautiful sermon you just laid out there and translate it back into this school mental health topic. So I don't think that intervention programs that focus on mental health topics directly are generally a good idea. Not universal. Not The term in education is tier 1, and tier 1 just means every student in the school is getting that lesson. Tier 2 means you may identify a small group of students that need some additional support, and maybe focusing on a specific behavior, and you're going to maybe get more specific with them than you would with that tier 1 universal. And then there's tier 3, which is one-on-one, and that should almost not exist in a school, is my opinion about that. Because if we are needing to do tier 3, that means we need therapy. And for the exact reason that you laid out there earlier, I think it's always most appropriate for an entity other than the school to be the delivering entity of that service. And there's a really simple ethical explanation for why that should be. Multiple roles are not good for individuals, and they're not good for organizations. And that's a kind of a foundational general systems theory assumption in my opinion,
Can you
because
explain what you mean for the non-therapists in the audience?
yes, I can. And I lay this out there if people want to know more in the Substack article that I wrote. This idea that your primary function, if you're a school district, your primary purpose should be facilitating academic development. You should be an academic development entity. And if you're going to do mental health support, the mental health support, in my opinion, the top ceiling of it should be, we are going to teach you skills, or we're going to engage in interventions that will help return you in the short term to readiness for academic performance, to readiness for learning. So if you're in some short-term acute distress that's part of a larger situation, but that's kind of flaring itself up at school, we're going to help you get through that flare up. We're going to return you to readiness for learning in the school context. And then for any mental health needs beyond that, we're going to look to refer to outside resources, outside agencies to be able to help. So I'd say that it's not good for a school to attempt to be an academic development facilitating agency and a mental health treatment looking for remission of a disorder entity. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's about creating an environment that doesn't exacerbate students' anxiety by making it clear what is expected of them in that environment. And one piece of advice that I might offer to parents who, let's say you have a child with a behavioral issue and you're considering engaging them in mental health services is, as I mentioned earlier, the role of choice is crucial. And sometimes kids with behavioral issues are, when they're acting out, they're testing boundaries. They are seeing what they can get away with. And that's normal, right? And the looser you show them your boundaries are, or the more inconsistent, the more you're teaching them to keep pushing to find those boundaries. And I think sometimes it's powerful to offer a child a choice and say, "Look, I'm confused. I don't know what it's like to be in your brain, in your body. I don't know what motivates you. I can only guess. But from the outside, here's the behavior that's causing problems. Here's the thing we need you to start doing or stop doing." Now, since I can't get in your head and I don't know if you're doing this on purpose or on accident, I don't know if it's deliberate or not. So here's the thing. If it is a choice, you can stop doing that right now, and then we can move on, and we won't have to have any further discussion about this. If you're telling me that you lack control, that this is not a choice, then we're going to need to get you some mental health support. And the goal, one of the goals at least, of that mental health support needs to be that this behavior stops, right? Because we don't run out of the classroom during learning time, or because we don't punch your sister when you want a toy, whatever, like whatever the boundary is, here's the behavior that needs to stop. Here's what we need to see in its place. You can choose to stop doing it, but if you continue the behavior, that's gonna tell us maybe you need help because this is coming from something that you really don't understand. And I think that setting that type of boundary, saying either stop the behavior or we go to therapy, is important for a couple reasons. It gives the kid choice. It makes clear what is the objective, right? Like what needs to happen and why. It's not this ambiguous, am I being graded on the quality of my soul? Is my heart and mind being scrutinized by the same people who are judging me on my math performance? It's not
Hmm.
that. Or
Right.
by different people, by mom and dad for that matter. It's not like, am I under scrutiny? Is the character of my soul in question? It's there's behavior that needs to start or stop, and it can be explained to me in plain English why I can't keep doing that, and then I have the choice, and I get to communicate whether I feel like I have the self-control or not, and then if my actions and my words don't line up, then there's gonna be, some kind of further action taken.
Hmm. And in general, in this type of situation that you're describing, we don't remove discipline practices because has a diagnosis attached to them, or or even because they may be an identified homeless student. Now, on that topic, the law gets involved, and we actually just saw a little bit of relaxation, allowing the schools a little bit more leeway about discipline. But there are actually federal laws on the books that can limit the type of discipline you employ. Now, so there may be some special circumstances that require a little more flexibility, like homeless students, for that. But in general, we shouldn't remove discipline. We shouldn't have tiers of discipline within a school for particular behaviors, depending on what group you're a part of. You cannot have predictable, consistent routine without clear boundaries that everybody can adhere to. And a lot of the efforts that I think have posed problems in schools are ones that have attempted to just totally relax discipline in areas where there is a mental health diagnosis, or where there's some particular, special category of student there. Um, and I've never seen that turn out that well. It makes a huge mess. And so me saying all this out loud, I'm in full acknowledgement that even in Texas, like, our current law isn't aligned to what I'm saying. This is what Jonathan wishes were the case, across the board, if that makes sense.
No, I'm not quite following.
So, well, just kind of speaking about use the McKinney-Vento students as an example. So, up until this year, you the hurdle to temporarily remove a student from class for an identified homeless student was extremely, extremely high. And they put some concessions in through, I apologize, I'm not going to remember what bill it is that they did that passed that enacted this, but they did put allowances in place where if a student represents a physical safety risk to those around him or her, you can temporarily remove them, or even remove them on a longer term if the problematic behavior doesn't resolve in a particular amount of time. So you can see, like, how there can be real serious challenges. I had a school I've had several schools working with special ed students who were very physically very large students who, they have their one school building, and the students maybe have a disorder that makes them, scratch that word, that contributes to them maybe being physically aggressive. And so you have the situation where you have this very large, strong student going through the halls and striking staff members, striking other students, and the special ed law won't let you fully remove them. Like, you've got to have as much inclusion and mainstreaming of that student as possible. And then, of course, that causes problems with your classroom culture more widely, because you have, like, there's this physical risk from this person, and it makes it unfair to the students who were there and who were trying to learn and who are able to conduct themselves according to the rules and norms of the school.
So
in the
you're
classroom.
saying that currently in Texas, students who are identified within the system as having special needs, whether that's because of they're in special education, they have a diagnosis, or they're under McKinney-Vento, that the behavioral standards are lower for those students. It's harder to
It's harder to discipline, to
okay.
have discipline programs because you can't you are prohibited from doing, certain actions like taking a kid into an in-school suspension type environment, for instance. Or like, so go back to McKinney-Vento students for a second. There's a really good rationale for not expelling those students, which is that if they don't have a home to go back to, or the home that you're sending them back to is going to put them in a worse state than having them at school, then you probably don't want to expel them. Another example for that you would think would be a good idea for expulsion, but really is not. We mentioned school violence prevention earlier, and I want to at least touch on that. So we have a behavioral threat assessment process. Every school in Texas has to have a behavioral threat assessment team, and one of my jobs is to train those teams. And so we do a couple of workshops to help them with that. Um, and you would think, if you've got a student who's making violent threats or who's engaged in some attack planning behavior, you think might have engaged in some attack planning behavior, that expulsion would be a good idea. The problem is if you expel that student, they're still in your town and they've been engaging in attack planning and they are moving into some kind of social emotional isolation that is enabling them to stay in this pattern of thinking about wanting to plan attacks, which is not a normal psychosocial behavior for a student. It's indicative of underlying problems. So expelling that student is not a great idea because the spirit of behavioral threat assessment is we want to keep a warm hand of support on the shoulder of that student and actually improve supports until such a time as we can all agree as a team that the student is no longer on a pathway to violence. That's the terminology that's used
So that's
in the
really
training.
tricky. You bring up a good point, right? Expelling the student doesn't solve the problem. In fact, it might make violence more likely. But at the same time, keeping them in the school environment it increases the risk of danger to everyone's safety. So what do you do? It feels similar to a lot of the kind of situations that I guide parents through where they're walking through a field of landmines and choosing their moves very carefully.
Mhm. So behavioral threat assessment is one of the main things that I talk about in the article that I wrote. That and tricky is the exact feeling because we have these statutory requirements. The schools have to follow these procedures currently because it's the law on the books. The end part of behavioral threat assessment is a case management process. And so the textbook answer to your question there about what do you do is you engage in a variety of like social emotional support, very routine check-ins with usually a school counselor, but maybe a classroom teacher that student identifies as somebody they kind of get along with, just to keep a hand kind of on the pulse of how that student's doing more closely. It can involve checking the student's backpack and person every morning for a period of time when they come in the school, which is uncomfortable. And at the same time, it provides some necessary accountability if we are going
Sorry.
to have the student remaining in the classroom.
Whose job is it to check the student's backpack?
It generally would be like a student resource officer. Student resource officers are very frequently part of the behavioral threat assessment team. And that would typically be a duty that would be more appropriate for law enforcement. Could be an administrator. It's not going to be the school counselor. The school counselor is going to be kind of in the point person support role
Sorry,
to
law
help.
enforcement? You mean police on campus?
Yes, uh-huh, yeah. Now, student resource officer is a little bit different than your typical beat cop kind of idea. The intent of student resource officer is different. I won't say that student resource officers always embody this, but student resource officers are generally like about half the time they're not in their full gear, like they maybe have a polo shirt, and they are armed and they got their badge on their belt, but they are a kind of an additional presence keep to keep the school safe in general during the day, to discourage attack planning, to discourage anyone from actually attempting to carry out an attack. Because if you have the presence of an armed person, you're a lot less likely to experience attack as a school.
Is this a norm in Texas? Do you know how
Yeah.
common this is throughout the states? Because I haven't heard
Uh,
of this being everywhere.
so I would assume it would be very common in kind of your more conservative states. Something that it might or might not blow your mind. I don't know. It would certainly maybe blow some of your viewers' minds. In a lot of our small and rural schools all over Texas, there's a sign out front of the school, and it says, these are schools that are too small maybe to have an SRO, or they don't have a good resource for an SRO, so they can have trained guardians. And a guardian is a teacher, a coach, an administrator who goes through a training course in active threat response. So what this sign says is our school has guardians who are covert and armed, who will use whatever force necessary to stop any attempt at a violent attack on the school. These signs are everywhere out here in this, well, really all over the state of Texas. You can Google and see, and they use kind of a standard set of text. Very, very common.
So the point
School
is that
resource
these
office.
guardians blend in and nobody's supposed to know who they are,
Mhm,
but they're armed
mhm,
and trained.
mhm. Absolutely. And so the sign is a deterrent, hopefully. It's saying this is not a soft target, so don't expect it to be. And I'm a very pro 2A person. And I've seen the training course materials that these folks go through, and I've been through these kind of training course materials for serving as a church guardian. And the training is generally very good. And the what I learned from going through that training is that over 90% of the time, if an attack planner learns that the target is not a soft target, they will leave that alone and go on to a different target. Now, I don't want anything to be a target, but if having trained guardians and putting a sign out will, reduce our chance of having an attack here by 90%, that's pretty good. I'm totally fine with that sign being up there. I'm totally fine with those staff members, being armed and trained. And I hope they never, ever, ever have to use it, because I hope the deterrent effect is what actually makes the difference there. But they do have the capability to react if they need to. People don't like to talk about this. It's kind of an ugly topic. And it is. I don't think we should feel good about it. But the reality is there's no utopia in which we completely end violence across the board. Not with human capability anyway. You know, we've got to have some things in place that are reasonable and realistic, that will actually help on the ground. So I think that idea of having folks prepared to react in via training is very important and very good. The whole behavioral threat assessment process it really isn't what people think it is. I mentioned the soft hand of support part of it. It's really a team development and communication program that just has a very particular purpose of noticing kids who are displaying concerning behavior. If I was to describe to somebody what I'm actually doing when I train those teams, it is helping them to cultivate awareness of some early signs and typical behaviors that you might see, and coaching them in rehearsing how they'll communicate as a team when they encounter a student that shows one of those smaller signs that might be just, it's a little puzzle piece and it's not enough for me to say, yes, I'm very concerned. But if I'm trained to notice that little puzzle piece and then I bring it to the team, then somebody else on the team goes, oh, you know what? So and so also said this the other day, and I hadn't done anything about it yet, but that's also very concerning. So then, in over 80% of attacks that have been carried out, there has been leakage in the community about the attack planner's intent. But usually, the individuals who are floating around out there receiving the information don't have enough to really act on it. So the idea is, well, we develop a team whose job it is to notice this type of information and compile it just within the members of that designated team who've been trained to do this. And it helps us to catch students who are on the pathway to violence in their mind, in their, individual actions at home when they're not at school, before they actually get to the point of planning an attack. And then bringing supportive interventions in place, which are probably going to include outside counseling referrals and coordination with a school counselor and the therapist outside, that are going to involve those safety measures like checking the backpack and potentially checking the person of the student, the some additional kind of case management, and social work type functions that we talked about, connecting them to resources if they happen to need that. So that's kind of the whole process, start to finish,
Well,
in
I
a
think you make
summary.
a
So
strong case for it. I think we can all get behind school shooting prevention. I'm hearing that this is specifically for students. Do you know if there's I do wanna ask, by the way, what those signs that you look out for are, and then what some of the initial steps you take with a student are. It leaves open the question of non-student school shooters, like, because there's been a lot of those, right? Young people, 18, 23 years old, who maybe target a school that they had gone to in the past, or they just target a random school, or they target a religious school if they're, let's say, anti-Christian. Um, and I don't suppose any of this would translate over to how to catch those people in the community, 'cause that's a whole
we
different kinda can of worms, right?
it is a very different can of worms because it really falls under the jurisdiction of the FBI mostly to identify and catch these folks. However, the training that we use was written by the FBI and the Secret Service around 2001. So we're using a school adapted version of the same curriculum that's used to train Secret Service and FBI agents who are out there, hopefully watching and hopefully intervening in some of these cases before they are in the actual enactment phase of an attack.
That's really
Um,
great to know.
yeah, same training material. And so the signs and the symptoms, one of the things they say is profiling is not useful. So we're not trying to profile a student at all based on their appearance, based on their social history, their economic history, anything like that. That doesn't prove itself out well in being able to identify kids who may be attack planning. Really what we're looking for is a lot of the things you typically see in a worsening mental health condition in general. So increasing isolation, maybe they have been involved in bullying usually as a victim. Most often, attack planners may have been in a bullying victimhood role at some point. If you get somebody who's involved in instances of dating violence, if you see students who go through just very rapid changes in behavior or emotional states, it's out of character. Now, that one right there is not evident that somebody's attack planning, but it can be evidence of that. And it is evidence that hey, we may need to bring some other appropriate mental health supports in for that student. And so really what they tend to focus on is those kind of prohibited and concerning behaviors like being involved in violence, being caught up in bullying in some fashion. And then one that's kind of highly debated is, well, should we run a behavioral threat assessment on any student who has suicidal thoughts? And so I don't answer that question outright to the district because it's actually a local district decision where they set their threshold for, are we going to run a full behavioral threat assessment or not for a student? So I want the school to have autonomy, retain that autonomy. So usually what I help them think through with that is, okay, if you have a student who has suicidal ideation, you're going to bring in some supports for them, a few supports at school and hopefully a lot of supports outside of school. But we might not want to, some people might say we don't want to subject every student struggling with suicide to the level of scrutiny involved in a behavioral threat assessment, because then we might experience a paradoxical effect of they don't really want to come forward to us anymore because now we've put them under the big interrogation spotlight. And most of the schools actually bring it up from that standpoint. They're like, yeah, we don't want to push people into the corners and into the shadows. And so So I go, okay, so then if you think on the other end of the continuum there, if you're not going to conduct a behavioral threat assessment every time you get a student struggling with suicidal thoughts, what are a few questions you could ask them, or how are you going to rule out any other kind of behaviors on the side or motivations that could be involved with attack planning? How are you going to note and discover and document that part of it? Because I think if I'm not going to run a behavioral threat assessment every time we have a student with suicidal thoughts, I would want to be able to answer, how did I know with as much certainty as a person could have that that's all the student had going on? And then this team, the district team that I'm training, kind of wrestles with that question, and then they sort of plot out their own course, their own plan for where they want that threshold line to be.
That's a
And
really
as
good question.
Yeah, I'm thankful to get to work with a lot of really, really good minds on school safety in our state here, who have helped to kind of craft some of the policies and plans and how to implement a lot of this stuff. And so that's the kind of thought processes we walk through when we're doing those kind of trainings.
Are you a therapist in need of continuing education that's not over the top woke? Check out my colleague Lisa Mustard's pod courses. All of her pod courses are approved by the National Board for Certified Counselors. Right now, Lisa is offering my listeners an incredible deal. Get all 27 pod courses for only $44. That could meet almost all of your continuing education needs for the year. Visit lisamustard.com/podcourses and use code SOMETherapist to take $5 off of her $49 pod course bundle. Again, use code SOMETherapist at lisamustard.com/podcourses. I'll include that link and coupon in the show notes for your convenience. All right, now back to the show. So just to recap, you're looking for isolation, history of bullying, rapid changes in mood and behavior. Then you brought up the subject of suicidal ideation, which also raises a question of how is that suicidal ideation being expressed and to whom, and how are adults being brought into this essentially. But then you said that there's a lot of scrutiny in the behavioral threat assessment process. So how does that, I guess, so let's say this team of professionals has noticed some concerning signs in the student. It's not like a document has been produced that reveals this child's plan to harm anyone, but you want to do some kind of intervention and you say that there is a lot of scrutiny in the process. So how does that process get initiated?
A lot of times it may be that a student or staff member has overheard the student say something concerning, kind of making a really dark statement to a peer in the hallway, or somebody saw them post something concerning on social media. And every district has got like a little bit of training that they do about, and they do a good job of keeping it pretty general. Like, hey, if you see something going on that you think might be bullying, here's who you talk to. Or hey, if you see, any kind of thing that you think represents a risk of safety to the school, here's who you talk to. And the team at the district is the one that develops the method for reporting, like the answer to the question, who are you going to talk to, or how are you going to get this information to us? A lot of the schools that I work with they either use maybe like a Google form that serves as an anonymous report for a variety of things that might include bullying, or it might include risk of attack planning. They've seen some sign of attack planning going on, and they can get into this Google form. Or there are actually, and this one is, I have concerns about this one, because there are third party companies that will provide all of this to you, the service of being like your central reporting line and being kind of like an answering service. And that trends toward feeling a little big brotherish to me in some ways, or there is a risk that it could go that way. Um, and shout out to Katie Kernodle on X. We had a really good discussion about that part of this on Ryan Rogers' podcast a while back. Like, I don't want a situation where these private companies have access to all this data about students.
That sounds adjacent to a conversation I've had on this podcast with Deb Philman. So I would refer listeners to the episode that you mentioned and also the episode that I mentioned for more information on that.
Totally fair concerns, because big tech companies have not proven themselves particularly trustworthy on the area of using private data well, always.
Right.
So reasonable concerns out there about that. And what I said to Katie about it, and this isn't a it's not a good thing, but it's just the reality of it. If you're at a school that maybe has less than 300 students K through 12, and you have one school counselor type person, but she has 7 other job titles attached to what she does on a daily basis. Having some kind of vendor company that provides a service that you need that automates a lot of things for you is very attractive, and it's very helpful if it's not, like icky big brother behind the scenes. So I want us to be in a situation where we could have that kind of support for districts with the power of technology to help some of these little bitty places to do everything they need to do. But man, we need some really good assurances from those companies about how that data is going to be used.
Right.
Um, Senate Bill 12 that I mentioned earlier, shout out to Rebecca Smith, who was at AMHP. She helped get Senate Bill 12 passed, actually, and she wrote part of it, which is really cool. Shout out to her. There are some bits of information in there about, hey, if you're going to store mental health data, here's what here's what you have to make sure is in place as far as data protection for the student if you're going to rely on a service like that. And so I'm like, that's really, really amazing. I'm glad that we're starting to get some protections in place. And I would encourage other states to look at those concerns and to think about that seriously if they're looking at allowing vendors like that to be used for that purpose. So, but back that's all on that original question you asked a minute ago, which is how does the reporting happen? Well, hopefully you've done a little bit of good training with your school community, your students especially, and your teachers and your cafeteria workers and your bus drivers, who are the people who might be well positioned to overhear a threat or a concerning statement. And then your school has provided instructions for you're going to log onto this app, or you're going to click this link on our school district website, or you're going to go and find this person or that person, ask to talk to the school counselor, and here's what you tell 'em. And then that information gets sent to the behavioral threat assessment team, and they have a standard form which is called the pre-screener, and it just helps you work through your own based on your own thresholds for when are we going to conduct an assessment versus not. And it's just got a handful of questions on it about the situation, and you work your way through those questions. And if you follow that worksheet guidance, you'll pretty much have the answer at the end of, yes, we're going to run a full behavioral threat assessment because we believe that there's enough legitimate concern the student could be on a pathway to violence that they need that extra focus, support, and attention. Or, hey, the pre-screener really shows like maybe we're just dealing with suicidal ideation, and we don't think that the student actually represents a risk of violence or on a pathway to violence. So we're going to send them through a supported process, but we're not gonna go through the whole process of like looking into their whole social media history top to bottom, and interviewing parents and interviewing family members and interviewing classmates and all of that kind of stuff.
So, how do these concerns get raised to the student and the parents?
Oh, as far as like if a student is on a pathway, or we think they might be on a pathway.
Yeah, any kind of risk, whether it's harm to others, harm to
Mhm.
self.
So if we're talking about a behavioral threat assessment situation, like one that, let's say, yeah, we think we need to run a full behavioral threat assessment, the school's required to contact the parent either by phone or in writing and let them know, hey, your student is showing some behaviors that are concerning, and we need to look into that more closely. So we're going to be engaging in a behavioral threat assessment process. And we welcome you to be a source of collateral information about your students' current behavior, emotions, well-being, and we also want you really involved in the support process. And so just kind of like, here's what you can expect. We'll be interviewing people and kind of looking more closely into what's going on in the student's life. And where I live, little bitty schools, everybody knows everybody. It's pretty much a phone conversation usually. And sometimes reasonably well received, a lot of times sometimes not, because nobody likes for it to be insinuated that their child might represent a risk of harm to somebody. But in general, it's handled as a very supportive thing. And there may be, suicide risk assessment that's happening. There may be discipline that happens if, let's say, we find that the student has broken a law in the process of attack planning. Like, they're not removed from school discipline altogether, and they're not removed from legal consequences. Sometimes, if, let's say, we have an SRO involved, the SRO has a legal obligation to report up his chain of command, potentially in situations where laws may have been broken in an attack planning process. And so, but I think that's overall a good thing about the process. Like, there's legal consequences, there's school level discipline consequences, but we're not going to remove the supportive hand from the shoulder on the behavioral threat assessment process. That stuff is happening outside the bubble of behavioral threat assessment, and we're keeping all of the threat assessment process just kind of supportive, but but definitely investigative, if that makes sense. And you're just always going to have a certain level of discomfort, I think, when you're talking about looking at somebody's whole social media history and going through their locker and and asking a lot of specific questions about their behavior all around. So did that answer your
Hmm.
last question there?
Yeah, and I mean, I talk to parents. Oftentimes, you don't even know where to look or how to interpret what they're seeing when they look, because it's not just social media; it's also things like Discord
Yes.
and their ChatGPT history. And I've talked to many parents who thought they had certain sites and apps blocked, and they didn't. Um, yeah, it's a tough world to navigate out there, and then also kind of the code that kids talk to each other in online as well. So you're doing this in Texas. What do you know about how similarly or differently things are handled in other states?
I know that a lot of states are using the same or very similar training framework, and I want to say it's somewhere around 30 states are using some version of behavioral threat assessment type program that is like ours, based on the FBI and the Secret Service training materials. I could be wrong about that total number of states, but I believe that is pretty close. And in the cases that those states are using the same training material, I would imagine that their policies and procedures look very similar, because it comes straight out of the training material as designed for by the Secret Service and the FBI. Beyond that, I don't know too much more specific detail. And I know there are a lot of states that are not using, at least somewhere around maybe 20 states that are not using that type of program currently. So I wish I had more specifics on that. There's just so much to know about what's going on in the state right here, and especially in a year like this year where we have legislative cycle, and now we've got to get in and figure out, okay, what are all the implications for Senate Bill 12 on the behavioral threat assessment process and on serving McKinney-Vento students and on general mental health support. There's not a lot of time to look at other states. It's a pretty full job.
Well, you're doing a lot, and thank you for what you're doing. I was thinking about, I can't remember where I saw some ridiculous question from someone in the peanut gallery on some post, but someone wrote something about, well, how many, acts of violence have you prevented? And I'm thinking about, the whole point of prevention is that things don't happen. And we
Yes.
really have no way of knowing how many lives that you've saved, but I want to thank you for saving those lives.
There were around 120 attacks planned between 2010 and 2020, I believe, that were successfully prevented
Oh,
that
wow. So you do
that
have
we
data
know
on that.
about.
That's amazing. And just
Yeah.
in Texas?
No, that was nationwide.
Okay.
Nationwide, according to the Secret Service and the FBI, at least 120 attacks that we know of were averted in that decade between 2010 and 2020. And so what you're saying is exactly on target, that the if we are doing a good job, we won't know. And take that even further. So the number one job of the team that performs behavioral threat assessments is not performing behavioral threat assessments. The number one job is to put programs in place that support the development of positive school culture. And as marriage and family therapists, we know like the culture and the conflict temperature in a family produce behavioral outcomes among the children in that family. And so we want to have low conflict temperature and we want to have a good family culture in order to reduce those negative behavioral outcomes in kids at home. And when we talk about schools, I'm not talking about schools replacing parents. I tell counselors all the time, I cannot replace what a parent would provide to a student or a client ever. I can supplement a lack that they've experienced, but it will never amount to replacing it. But I tell them we can at least create a culture in our school where we have the greatest likelihood possible that a student would feel comfortable coming forward if they were to learn concerning information about a classmate. And even better than that, we make craft an atmosphere that invites a student whose home life is really, really difficult to connect and plug in at school, such that school really is the safe place for them. And they never get further than a thought or two down the road of being on a pathway to violence. And so that's why the job of that team is first and foremost to pay attention to culture and to try to help produce positive culture, because the rest of the program won't work if you don't have a good, open environment of communication and trust that's there. And so that's kind of a core reason why I make an argument for some reasonable amount of mental health support in the school, because some school districts are relationally dysfunctional, just like some families are relationally dysfunctional, and they will not be able to become relationally functional without support. And so some of those good SEL programs that I referred to earlier that are out there, they do exist. They aren't chock full of indoctrination, are part of a plan that can help make a very functional relational environment that can stop attack planning way upstream, that can give students alternative models for healthy relationships that they can imprint in themselves and use to break their own intergenerational cycles of conflict, divorce, addiction, things like that. And those students, like those McKinney-Vento students I talked about, their families aren't going to take them to treatment or even think, hey, that might be a good idea. Sometimes, a lot of the time. And so sometimes the school is the entity that should not be doing that treatment, but that is best positioned to find the student who could benefit from help and nudge the family a little bit. Go, hey, I think you could benefit. I think your student could benefit from a little counseling. Can we connect them with this agency? Which in itself requires a little bit of training and a little bit of awareness in mental health topics and in intervention, even just how to talk about those things. And so that's where I really see the kind of the indispensability tying into this whole process is we need a certain amount, we need enough skill and training in districts to help restore students to readiness for academic functioning in the short term, and to know when, where, and how to refer and connect to outside agencies who can hopefully be that treatment and total recovery entity for those students.
Well, I think you've made a beautiful case for that sort of just right balance of mental health support in schools and what that should look like. And thank you so much for your excellent work.
I'm honored by that, Stephanie. And thanks for the chance to just get in here and talk about all this and just to let people know that it's not all like a hairy mess of ick and ideology out there. There's a lot of really powerful good work that happens out there, and I get to shine a spotlight on that. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure. Oh, and let's remind people where they could find you.
Yes. Oh, thank you. So I am on X, and my handle is @systemic-texism. And I am on Substack at the same handle, @systemic-texism.
All right. Thank you for listening to You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly take a moment to rate, review, share, or comment on it using your platform of choice. And of course, please remember, podcasts are not therapy, and I'm not your therapist. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for this awesome theme song, Half Awake, and to Pods by Nick for production. For help navigating the impact of the gender craze on your family, be sure to check out my program for parents, ROGD Repair. Any resource you heard mentioned on this show, plus how to get in touch with me, can all be found in the notes and links below. Rain or shine, I hope you will step outside to breathe the air today. In the words of Max Ehrmann, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world.